So yesterday we learned about the escalation of the war, and you typed something about that into Canvas chat for the bell ringer. The protest assignment, hopefully you were able to type 3 to 5 sentences for each of those songs about what its main idea was and why, and submit that for a grade today. And so we talked about the escalation and how both sides use different strategies and types of fighting, and what exactly caused the Americans to increase the escalation, starting with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. So today we'll look at how it became even more divided. So the division in Vietnam was intended to look just like Korea. And they even picked a line of latitude just like in Korea, except it was the 17th parallel. So the end goal for the United States, because they kind of learned their lesson from Korea, pushing the whole way up to China and then getting pushed back, they and the South Vietnamese may have been willing to settle just to divide the country in half at the 17th parallel. That wasn't going to happen, though, because Ho Chi Minh had convinced the Vietnamese people, including some people in the South, that the country needed to be unified. Because after all, they were all Vietnamese. They all spoke Vietnamese. They're all part of a similar culture. So therefore, why should someone else come in and divide the country in half? And this opinion didn't exist simply because we eventually sent over troops. It started when we started sending advisors, because the advisors were seen as a foreign influence. So even our advisors were seen as a foreign influence. In South Vietnam, there was sympathy for the North's movement. In South Vietnam, there was sympathy for the North's movement. So that would go as far as people that would fight with, alongside the Viet Cong, and people that would simply say, well, these are our fellow people, so as they're moving through, even to fight the Americans, we'll give them supplies or help them. And so that sympathy, of course, wavered in how radical it was. It also wavered in why they sympathized. Some of them is because they believed in the idea of making Vietnam independent. Some of them believed in communism, and some of them hated the South Vietnamese government, as we saw in the video and then it indicated in the reading and earlier in the notes. The leadership of South Vietnam was often corrupt and cruel. So there were three reasons why there was some sympathy in the South: pro-independence, pro-communism, or anti-South Vietnamese government. In the United States, in the meantime, our division didn't actually start until, as I indicated earlier, the end of Johnson's administration. When the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was passed, there actually was overwhelming American support, mostly because people believed we actually had been attacked twice in the Gulf of Tonkin. But in the government, there was even doubts. LBJ was really only doing this because he didn't want to lose a country to communism. He actually wanted to spend most of his time on the Great Society, helping to lift people out of poverty. He was furious as the amount of money Vietnam costs went up and up and up because it meant he was going to have to make cuts to programs at home. And there were a couple of things that are going to cause this war to drag on and for slowly but steadily the rise of dissent to grow in the United States. One was the Ho Chi Minh Trail because it proved quite a few things, that they were easily able to resupply themselves. We're a much more powerful, rich country, but they seem to just keep being able to introduce resources. It also showed, of course, that it was a defensive war for them. They were able to use the terrain to their advantage, whereas we were not. And the last point would be it also showed that they had numerous access points into South Vietnam, as it is indicated up there on the map. A couple of the most southern points even were close to the capital city of Saigon. This leads to the second issue that would cause the dissent in America to grow significantly, and that was the Tet Offensive. Up to this point, up to the Tet Offensive, Americans, a significant majority of them, believed that Vietnam was an easy, winnable war. But then the Tet Offensive happened. Now, there are a couple things about this to remember. First of all, the North was beaten back. They lost. They weren't able to take over Vietnam through the Tet Offensive. On the other hand, though, we're always told they're weak, they're on their last leg, they can't make it much longer, they're running out of people, they're running out of supplies. But this proved that they were still a very formidable force and that they carry out such a massive attack on such a large scale without the helicopters, without a large-scale railroad system, without the industrial system that we have to produce things. And so it was clear that maybe North Vietnam wasn't as weak as people believed. So North Vietnam was not as weak as people believed. But here's the reasons why we weren't having as much success as we would have wanted to. Is first, the war was extremely limited. World War II, which many Vietnam soldiers' fathers would have fought in, we didn't have a problem with bombing cities, including civilians. In fact, it happened quite a bit. In Tokyo alone, we burned 100,000 people alive. But in Vietnam, that wasn't the case. We have been much more restricted in our efforts. Ho Chi Minh was also extremely popular in both the north and quite a bit in the south as well. So this is another reason why we really didn't have much of a chance. He was like the George Washington of Vietnam. The third reason is we couldn't bomb Laos and Cambodia, or the neighboring countries where the trail ran through. And that was because they're different countries. A lot of people didn't feel the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, even though Congress passed it, was legal when it came to international law. It would have violated those other countries' borders. Of course, when Nixon came to office, he didn't care anything about that, and he did bomb Laos and Cambodia. But the next one was that we could not identify the enemy. As we pointed out yesterday, especially the Viet Cong often used civilians. And so it was often difficult to identify the enemy. And the last one would be low morale, which is spelled Morale. Low morale. Both of the soldiers and then eventually the public. For a lot of soldiers, especially the ones that were drafted, they were asking to fight thousands of miles away for a war they didn't really identify with or have any idea what was going on. Civilians, in the meantime, were constantly reminded of the horrors of war through a lot of the reporting that happened because, as they mentioned in the video, for the first time there would be TV cameramen there sending back images, lots of photographers, and so these type of brutal images kept being beamed back to the American public. Eventually that wore away at the people's morale as well. And probably one of the most infamous images, let me see where it is, would be this one here in the bottom right-hand corner. That is in the city of Saigon. The Viet Cong often used terrorist tactics, and that is one of the terrorists that was captured right there. And this is the sheriff of Saigon. And it was in the middle of the Tet Offensive. He decided there's no time for a trial, so he shot him in the head right there while American journalists were taking pictures and shooting film. So that got beamed back to the United States, and it looked brutal, and it showed that the South Vietnam government wasn't interested in due process, which is kind of, in an emergency situation, that's kind of hard to carry out in the first place. But obviously, these kinds of things burned into the American people's minds. Then, of course, Richard Nixon came along, and he proposed in his election campaign in 1968 that we should slowly turn the war effort over to Vietnam. So that way, South Vietnam was doing the bulk of the fighting, and then eventually all of it. It seemed like a simple proposal, especially since his own campaign ended up ruining the peace process, so that way he could use the war as a campaign promise. By the way, they said that in the video too, and that might seem, wow, that was pretty terrible, that seems treasonous, but a lot of that information didn't come out until decades later, so we didn't know until long after Watergate that any of this kind of stuff had happened. Yeah, there probably could have been a lot of other stuff as well. He was, throughout his career, he was known for some pretty dark tactics that he would use in order to get things done.
At least he got known.
Yeah, but I mean, many people would make the case how many more soldiers died in the meantime while we dragged out the peace process, and there's some other points that could go against them there. But what I would like to do now is for the remainder of the period, I noticed only 3 people have turned in the reading so far. So hopefully, in the last section of the class, you can get at least 2 of those pages done, maybe more, and then submitted today so that way everyone has completed the reading. So please make sure that you have the reading open and that you are working on the next page that you have to go before you submit it.